They said the barn breathed all winter, and that the rattle in its loft was not rat or wind, but a breath held under rafters as tight as a lid. When the thaw came, the hinges swelled and made a sound like a man clearing his throat, and the smell it exhaled was not hay, spirits, wintergreen, old lye. Men called it cider, because there was no sense in naming a thing that would not be put to table. I put my palm to the plank where the latch falls, and the cold climbed my wrist with the purpose of a hand that knows the road. The place sits on a shoulder of hill where the map gives up on names and just writes trees. South of it, the road goes, down into a hollow with a meeting house that gathers shape out of fog as if God were considering it again. North, the timber goes thick until a man stops walking because he no longer belongs to his own feet. The barn is plain New England, red, a long rectangle with a gable end to the wind, granite blocks for a foundation, a summer beam black across a span where oxen once backed in with a cart to unload hay to the bay. The loft runs the length of it with a trap in the floor where men bring bales up and a pulley under the ridge. There is a cupola set like a cap on the ridgepole for heat to go out of when cows make their winter weather. Under the cupola, the swallow nests sit in a tally that remembers more honestly than any man's book. In the summer of 1889, I was sent by the county to take custody of a trunk of papers belonging to the estate of Dr. Ezra Vale, late of the town. A man remembered on one side of the ridge for bringing babies and on the other for mending bones, and on both for charging less than he should. The trunk lay in the kitchen of a house that had forgotten soup, under a staircase that had taught children to count. It was the smell that told me to go to the barn and not to the trunk, the thin vinegar of camphor, the sweetness of wintergreen. Under it, and beneath both a flat iron note you cannot mistake once you have been made to know it. The trunk held ledgers, letters, a length of red silk ribbon wrapped around a roll of papers too tightly for the silk not to have learned the history of the ink. The barn held the rest. Vale had started on the river in Windsor, where he apprenticed, to a doctor who had gone to Dartmouth and who wrote longhand in a tidy hand that made you trust the sentence before you reached the predicate. In 1818, when Castleton put up its medical college and men in wool coats began to come into these hills with calipers and a confidence, Dr. Vale took his skill inland, moving it house to house with the humility a man acquires when his mare balks at winter. His practice moved with the river like a rumor, then left it, then came back to it. His book recorded births, bleedings, one amputation of a frost-rotted foot, 2 removals of gallstones described in a prose so devout it is hard to know whether you are reading medicine or a prayer. Between those neat entries, on leaves half, as wide and with the ink gone rusty in a way that betrays a second hand and a hurried room, is a different ledger. Borrowed, the column says in a careful script that does not belong to Vale, and beside it, returned. And between those, 2 words, the space where it asks a man what he is. The headings are the work of a younger man, one of the Castletown or Hanover fellows, who signs his name only with an initial and the number of his class. Under borrowed, he writes 1 subject, male, adult, and under returned, the same, safe engraved with stones, paid. The word stone shows up wherever men ran out of souls to put back. On the next line, 1 juvenile. There is a blank where a return ought to be, and someone has later written in Vale's gentler hand, left at river. In the margin, a price, $3 to Amos. Amos Pike was the sexton at the meeting house, and when I put his name into my mouth, my tongue remembered the taste of iron the barn air had left there. There was no ether in 1819. There was laudanum and whiskey and winter cold, and the argument a man can put to himself when he has made a case. To instruction, a Castleton man wrote on a scrap slipped into the spine of Vale's ledger. To science, Vale adds, to relief of the living, as if the ledger could be persuaded the word belongs in that room. The receipts in the Trunk take a plain Yankee tone about the things you need for anatomy. Spirits of wine and of wintergreen, saleratus to take a smell from a board, lye soap, camphor, pins, not sewing but long, sewing too, because shirts must be mended. There is a bill for 12 lengths of rough pine, fit for coffins. There is a receipt made out to unknown for nails, 3 and 6, paid in cider and 1 lamb. The lamb has a notation beside it in Vale's hand, not eaten. In town, a meeting is called when people need to put words in the air to justify what their hands are going to do without permission. The minutes in the trunk, written out in a clerk's pride, read like men working to convince themselves to be merciful. On the matter of the poorhouse dead, it says, we are bound by charity to give their remains decent disposal. Under that, the same hand notes that Dartmouth has written, inquiring politely if the town is disposed to be forward in the cause of science. In the margin, the deacon has put his scripture verse. They vote to open the poorhouse ground on a night when the thaw has not yet turned to slime, when the ground can be persuaded with tools, when a team can be taken out without traces sinking up to a horse's shoulder. They vote to send Amos. They do not vote to send Dr. Vale because they do not need to. He keeps his barn ready and his lamp trimmed. The rest takes place the way a cupboard opens when you press on it right. You can see his work now not in cuts, but in the memory of cuts in wood. Along the edge of the trap in the loft floor, there is a line that never cured, a fat line of grease, from tallow in hand. Nothing but a bone makes that thickness in a crack. The pulley under the ridge has a burnish a hay rope does not make. It would be nothing to a stranger. To a man who has moved meat, the marks tell their versions of the story with a modesty that buys their right to carry it. There is a trestle. The thing looks like a cider table, where the planks run lengthwise, and the gap between 2 boards has been filled with shavings, as if something kept finding its way down that men agreed should not. There is a chest in the loft that was not made to hold anything you would show your mother. Wintergreen, camphor, spirits. When you lift the lid, they come out to meet you with the urgency of the mouth of a man who needed them. At the back, wrapped in a shawl that even now carries the soft drop of a woman's perfume turned thin by 30 winters, is a book without a publisher's pride. It is a book of drawings, hands, fussed over and faithful, a foot that is absolutely not a block of marble, the bones of a wrist that admit to their fragile intentions. Notes in a young hand, flexor carpi ulnaris, as if it mattered the next day. Pronator teres, which never will to anyone who sleeps under a roof here. The date at the top, 1819. The teacher in the margin, Vale, in admiration or warning. Between 2 leaves, a thing dried like a leaf, flat. A button from a sleeve or a shirt pressed in ash and kept, a Bonier's tint in its grain. Pale, round, not a leaf at all. I did not put it to my mouth because some devotions are not owed to a book. They borrowed, they meant to return. The ledger is honest about the if and not and the stern interval between. Returned with stones. It says one spring when the snow went early and men felt guilt while the river could still carry it fast. Returned with sand. The winter of the big freeze, when the river took none and the ground would not. Not returned, the kin taking him once, and beneath it a note that has no business in a ledger and every business in a man. Wept. One juvenile, that blank left under return, sits in the book and in the barn at the same time. The barn smells like wintergreen all the way into July, which is a grammar everybody knows, regardless of dictionary or clerk. The neighbors knew without knowing. A thing lets itself be a secret so long as the town agrees to share it. Men who needed Vale to bring their babies told themselves the barn was for cider and harness. The deacon told himself the ground would open to take back what must be put there. The poor housekeeper told himself the living had no use for the skin the dead had vacated. The sexton told himself the sums were not generous, but then a man must be paid for a night that eats him. The women put camphor in their shawl boxes and found it vanishing and told themselves the smell in their linen was a moth's work and not a man's. The winter of 1819, a revival came over the hill, not tent, but a traveling exhorter in a black coat with bitter in his voice. He took his texts from bones whether or not his scripture obliged him. He told men their frames were instruments either, of grace or of hunger. He told women their bodies were not theirs. The meeting house held all 3 nights. Wicks were trimmed so close the lamps smoldered until hands learned to be quiet. After the 3rd night, they say, a team was seen on the road at midnight. It wore its bells covered and its driver's hat pulled low. Amos took the team across Eames's field to avoid the stones. Vale took the barn and let the loft be a room that pretended to be a place it was not. The next morning, the exhorter called for men to go to the poor ground and make certain it had not become a school of Satan. They went because a man must either move or break when he is called out that way. They found nothing because men who have learned long roads in winter leave no more than they mean to. I do not need to tell you that there were sometimes marks. The poor ground floods. Coffins lift their lids when frost cheats the nails and spring tells on a town. In the meeting house yard, a woman visiting her husband found a stone weight in the soil at the foot of a line. It felt wrong under her shoe. Wrong the way a word does in a mouth if you know the grammar from birth, even if you cannot parse. She got the day's crew with shovels and a civility, and they touched the stone and looked at each other, and half of them listed silently. The other half began to work, because men would rather move dirt than be looked at for not doing a thing. Under the stone was a pine box nailed by hands, not veils. Under the pine was nothing but a stain of wintergreen set like a ghost in sawdust. The deacon said a prayer out of time and put the boards back with clumsy care. The sexton washed his hands with soap at the pump until the skin hurt, and found the smell lived in the cuticles and not on the skin. He dried his hands in hay and went to his bed and counted to the number of this ledger entry and fell asleep before finishing because the body, unlike a book, gets to be tired. They taught the students in the barn how to cut with a good mercy. Vale insisted on it. He was a man with the patience of dairy and his craft. He showed them how to lift a thing and how not to sand it, and how to say the name to their own hand so the hand would never forget. He made them wash the board after with lye. He made them swear to return. He did not teach them how to speak to a woman whose baby's grave had been moved, because the world did not then offer a grammar for that. He worked out his own penances in hay, in spirits, in wintergreen. The barn kept his penances better than the men who learned under its cupola. You can smell a promise long after you have lost the words to name it. In the loft, by the trap, where a man would stand to set the shoulder of a thing into his hands, there are marks. Not claw marks, not a storybook. The crescents are neat and side by side, in pairs, as when a hand grips and leaves its measure not in wood, but in grease pressed down over dozens of hands. Too narrow for a large man's span. Too far for a child. The shape is a grammar learned not by fox or bear. I put my palm there and my wrist drew back because the cold ran so calm up it that I thought I might have dignity afterwards. It is not a haunting. It is a thing wood holds when winter and a work have taught it to be generous. The trunk gives up its last thing when you stop expecting justice and start expecting a ledger to be exactly itself. A small packet sealed with wafer addressed to EV, not to be opened by others. Inside a line, for when we are found out. Then, as if the pen had been set down and picked up after breathing, there is a debt of 5 to the Almighty. I will lay the stones myself. Do not let Amos be alone. The stones in the poor ground are plain and dutiful. The stones in the barn are arranged without pride in a corner where hay never fell, and where the floorboards are scoured with sand because someone imitated the river in a place it did not belong. The corner keeps cool in summer, when the rest of the loft bakes. That is the mercy a barn can give. In spring, the well down the slope throws up needles that have aged into the color of the liver and melted sugar. It tastes of iron if you give it leave. The Anatomist's barn is a story told in numbers and in ropes, in prices and in grease. The borrowed bodies belong to neither the college nor the parish. They belong to what a man can live with between winter and the first planting. Some of them went back. Some of them did not. The science is a neat hand. The morality is a smell in your sleeve you cannot describe without persuading yourself into company no one admits to. The country pardoned the doctor by letting his barn fall into other work. A farmer put a cider press where the table had been and cut his apples in a way that left his knife greasy with something that would not wash off in lye. His wife told him it was the tallow he had used to mend the axe, and he agreed because he intended to love her until they ran out. If you stand under the cupola in late March when the snow leaves the roof in a day and puts its hand through the floor of the loft as if to test the earth, you can hear the pulley complain. It does it twice, then learns its manners and does it once, and calls no one. If you walk down to the poor ground and step exactly where the deacon stepped to say a prayer at the wrong time for a right reason, the earth is honest under your boot, and does not resettle in a way a body would. If you read the ledger, the word borrowed stops asking permission, and the word returned sits there like a man who has been taught to be ashamed of something he did and believes it does him credit. The barn breathes. It breathes because the cupola has learned to be a throat, and because spirits will go where air lets them. It does not ask for a verdict. It asks you to put your hand to the trap, to the grease line, to the beam where rope ran, and count only as high as your own tongue can take and no higher. Then it tells you, in its own dry grammar, that winter is for learning and spring is for love, and that the debt is not to science or to law, but to the stones a man can carry alone without thinking himself righteous. The county kept its minutes, the way a winter keeps its ice, layer upon layer, with the oldest still visible through the newest if you look slantwise. In a bundle marked with the clerk's hand, roads and bridges, the sheet I had no right to find lay folded in the middle like a sin. On complaint of certain women, it said, the phrase already apologizing for itself, that graves at the poor ground have been disturbed, the selectmen do appoint a watch for 3 nights, to wit, Amos Pike and 2 men to be named by him, and do request the presence of Dr. E. Vale for the determining of the cause should the ground heave. The clerk put down heave, the way you write in a margin when you want to keep an oath from falling into your sentence. On a second line, written in a different ink, with its iron still sharp and the nib new, a hand I did not know added, no, firing in the yard. You do not need to fire where spirit of wine and wintergreen already ask air for permission. They set the watch in March, when the ground is most willing to be persuaded it remembers summer. The poor housekeeper lent a lantern with a cap of tin, punched in stars that threw a country heaven down on the mud, the way men like to think themselves blessed when they are not. Amos brought his own coil of rope and the reluctance of a man who has learned that certain tasks are easier after he has made his prayer, and certain tasks cannot bear prayer at all. They took a bench out of the meeting house because it was the only thing that would do, and set it in the yard and told their knees to be patient. The night made its inventory. A fox came and put his foot down in a way that told you he had the grace not to laugh. An owl remarked upon men in their own register. The river, which is everybody's witness when men want none, kept its habit and said nothing. Just before dawn, when breath will curl out of a mouth as if a man were practicing a sin under his shirt, the ground settled itself with the decency clay has when it has been asked to forgive. Amos rose to set his lantern closer, and his boot found a plank that should not have been where it was. Under the plank, a pine lid that had not been cut to measure by anyone who loved the work. He set his hand to it, and then put his hand down by his leg, and looked at the bench, because sometimes a man tells his body to sit absolutely still until the hearth of his chest decides if it will be merciful. He did not lift the lid. He put the plank back where it had been and made the others do the same, because there are nights when a man protects the day from having to make a speech. The trunk gave up a student's letter as if it had been training to be a confession. "Dear Mother," the boy wrote in a hand that had wanted to be careful and failed because he was cold, "we are instructed here in all humanity and with scruples, we are told, to exercise our faculties upon such materials as hard Providence has allotted for the better of our kind. Dr. Vale is a man of safe temper. He insists upon closure in every particular. The loft is warm and smells of neatness and of wintergreen. I have drawn 3 hands and 1 foot, and a part of a jaw which had tolerable teeth. I pray you continue to send me a little of your winter apples and perhaps 1 cake. I am, dear mother, your Isaac who loves you." At the bottom, as boys do when they are learning what their own words look like and suspect they are not to be trusted, he copied a phrase from the professor: "Return if you can, and if you cannot, restore." He had learned the rhythm and not the law. They had a dead watch in the meeting house yard the winter after, not because they thought to catch anyone, Amos did not need catching, but because men thought to comfort their wives and to tire their bodies enough that sleep would not be cruel. They made a hut from pine boughs and old canvas and put a little stove in it and called it the guard house, and a boy on the first night ran his fingers over the tin stovepipe until they stung and then put them in his mouth and tasted iron because the pipe was new and the lye from the soap the women had used to clean it had not cured. He dozed and woke to the slow rasp of the stove drawing, the pitchy breath of green wood trying its will on fire, and under that, a lighter sound, rope talk on ring, as if someone were setting work without asking the watch to move. He went out, into air so full of wintergreen and water it might have been a schoolroom, and the yard had the decency to be completely still. The rope sound was his heart insisting upon a ledger it had no intention of showing him. He grew up and named his sons after men who did not need help with the dead and kept the taste of iron as a private province in his mouth. Vale wrote his own penance on a scrap pinned with sealing wax to the end paper of the ledger, because a man who has persuaded himself of the usefulness of his trespass owes himself the trouble to put a number to it. 5, he wrote, thinking to pay it down in stones and winter work, and then crossed the 5 out and wrote still 5, and then did not write again for a month. In that month, a juvenile blank in the book stayed blank. A woman in the poorhouse on a road day sat with her shawl over her head and did not take bread because it would have meant moving her teeth. She watched the ditch where spring water made its own scripture and kept to it when everything in her wanted to go the other way. A cart at dawn went to the river, and a barrel hoop knocked against iron twice, and then the driver set his hand to it like a prayer he did not want his sons to hear, and the hoop learned to be polite. The juvenile blank held. Men of the committee pronounced the ledger in order and asked the clerk to thank Dartmouth for the little pamphlet and sent a letter back with a winter's courtesy in it. "We will be forward so long as Providence allows," and tied it with red silk because they had been taught to tie things. A woman, her name gives no comfort, made her own mort safes without knowing the word. This is a Scottish contrivance and not of Vermont, but grief has a way of inventing across oceans. She took 2 cart rails and 4 stones and made a gate she could set over the small hill she would not share. She did not set spring guns. She laid branches of winter hemlock and a twist of red yarn and told the yard she would know if anyone had moved what did not belong to them. And then she sat in her doorway until her husband brought in wood and set soup in a way that told you. Both of them knew there would be no more children, and both were ashamed of the truth for no godly reason at all. In the morning, the hemlock was as she had said it. In the night, the barn had breathed with a long patience. The pulley answered the snow sliding off the roof twice, and then in its decent way once, and the woman learned that there were 2 kinds of rest you could teach your body if you cared for even a living minute to be kind to it. The ground did not move for her because it had learned she would not bend to find out if it had. They tried a case in January, not of Vale, but of language. "Is it theft?" the deacon asked the men in their usual order. If the property is not one that has a claimant, the man from Hanover who had come to argue for instruction spoke of sinews and the laws of motion. The man from the poorhouse spoke of boxes and the price of nails. Amos did not speak because there are times when a sexton earns his position best by having a shut mouth. Vale put down his hands on the table. His hands had had babies put into them, and said exactly this: return or restore. The meeting voted to accept that as sentence for the winter and the spring, and the clerk wrote it down and made the letters heavy. And men thought a professional pride had been invented that day that did not require them to pretend not to know where boards and hoops went. The next thaw lifted a lid at the poor ground, and the smell that came up was not human decay. It was wintergreen learned into pine, and the men who had voted went home and washed their hands with lye, and their wives pretended to think it was a farmer's duty not to be idle. There was a boy's shoe in the loft later, when the cider press had turned the boards sweet to hide their other schooling. It lay under the edge of the trap where no one but a person on their knees would put his hand. The leather was black and had learned where little bones bend and where they do not. The sole had a grit worked into it in a line that had not been Hanover nor Windsor nor the road to Castleton, but the refuse of a yard and a poorhouse and a place the town had not yet taken into its vocabulary. I did not pick it up because a man who does not know what he asks when he touches a shoe he should not is of no use to a parish. I put my hand next to it and felt the cool go into my palm and set up housekeeping there as if it had been trained to do the work. On the plank near it, a smear of fat had taken a shape like a spoon print, and the taste that rose into my mouth without my willing any such indulgence was not soup. They burned a barn like this in another town because fire is the sentence people pass when they want to forget the exactness of a practice. The smoke smelled of instruction and of camphor and of terrible thrift, and in the ash men set their mouths to hard and called it finished. Vale's barn did not burn, it refused. The cider press and the hay and the wintergreen and the lye and the camphor found their own understandings and held until the men who might have set a torch were ashamed. The revivalist came back once, gray at the temples and righteous still. He spoke of bones in the valley dry and made the congregation stand to prove they had not gone hollow, and a herdsman outside the window who had come to tack a notice about a missing cow heard 2 knocks and did not stay to hear the one because he was not angel enough to do anything with that knowledge, but carry it home and sit with it until it went down into his dinner and could not be distinguished from food. INSA, Dartmouth's library. They have a letter in a student's portfolio that a gentle professor has written on the back of a list of reagents. "You must be pastoral even here," he writes, and then the line that the young man's mother would have loved if she had ever got to read it. "We deal with the living," he says. "Very well, but do not teach your hands to forget the weight of the dead. The weight is in rope and ring and grease and beam. The weight is in the way the loft holds its wintergreen as if it were a hymn learned under bread. The weight is in the list Vale made, 5, and in the careful indecency with which he kept to disperse it in stones and silence. The last of those stones, if your knees know where to kneel at a corner of his loft where no hay ever stayed hay, sits under your hand like a sentence said to you by someone behind you, and the cold that comes off it has no grammar and needs none." I signed a paper in the probate office and handed the trunk to a clerk with clean hands and a habit of keeping the corners of his mouth flat when men bring him stories they cannot keep to themselves. He put a number on it, and the number made it safe. It is what offices do. I walked back up the road because feet have to learn a pace. A car cannot teach you when you have taken wintergreen and rope into your sleeve. The barn looked at me the way old work does. My business when you are not here and yours when I let you. The cupola breathes because heat leaves through it and because winter made a thing upstairs practice exit and entry until upstairs believed itself a chest. I stood under it until the pulley gave me my lesson. 2. as if rope taking air before it worked. And then one, the decent finish a man owes when he is finished making a thing he must not name. I put my hand on the trap edge and made the sign. My grandmother called a rebuke against bad luck, even though I know better. The cool went up me as far as my tongue. I carried it out the door because a man who leaves such a thing inside without permission can expect to be visited, and I had my share of visiting already. The legislature, in a summer when men in coats forgot how far river mud travels on boots, passed a bill that made it all tidy. For the advancement of anatomical science, the title said, and below it a list of conditions by which the poor might be put at the benefit of the learned without any town being obliged to write out its shame. The college sent a letter with a seal that looked like a conscience if you squinted. It thanked the county for the regularization of an already existing compassion. In the meeting house, the deacon read the letter and men nodded because this made what had been necessary look so much like virtue they could take it to bed. Vale lived long enough under the new decency to find it harder to breathe. He ran his hands down the arms of his chair in the glebe house, and the wood told him a story his throat would not make into a sentence. He stopped writing "returned with stones" in the ledger and began writing "received by order," which is a kinder word if you have never carried a board in spring. He taught one more class in his loft, young men with careful hair and a neatness in their kit that would have done for a wedding party. They made their drawings of a wrist as if copybook letters would keep them clean. He watched them wash their hands with soap he had boiled himself and found the wintergreen had gone. Faint. The barn, deprived of excuses, took to breathing under the cupola as if to remind him that lungs that have been taught will go on without the mind's sanction. When he died, there was no scandal. The trunk went to probate because men with books like to own other men's words. The barn took a cider press and a family who minded their floors and not their neighbors. Children who could not be told not to climb learned the ladder to the loft, and their parents, who had been children when the place taught better lessons, let them go because you cannot forbid a barn without making it a church. A boy with quick feet lost his balance when a swallow startled and came down through the trap because even strong wood forgets that light and air make weight. He struck his shoulder on the edge where grease had taught the grain to be honest and lay on the floor, with his breath somewhere else. His father carried him to the kitchen and set him on a table that had learned more than bread and said nothing out loud. The doctor who came then was not Vale, but he had Vale's kit and his caution. He set the bone by habit and by a science men no longer found necessary to sneer at. The boy cried and then slept and lived. The father sat on the stoop with his mouth shut under the smell of old wintergreen, and his tongue, without permission, counted 2. And then, with the time it takes to wish a different past, 1. In the poor ground, the stones have all slouched equal. The nettles are generous. If you have need of them for a hand that grips too tight or a knee that tells on the weather, they will give you their sting. On the far side, under the hemlocks, there is a rectangle where nothing much will grow because someone long ago carved a gate into the soil that now lies down the way a sheep will when it has learned what you want from it. On a day when the frost comes up through the earth instead of down through the air, the ground there purls. It is not a noise. It is the adjustment of a habit to a new posture. In a certain angle of the afternoon, you can see a flatness in the grass and know that the stones that paid down Vale's 5 sit where the corner of the loft remembers a floor that never took hay. Amos lived to an old reluctance. In his last winter he sent for me, not because he had forgiven himself, but because he had learned that if you put your story into a parish, it will take hold in wood better than in anyone's ear. He was not a man who liked to be looked at. He sat with his hands under a blanket as if they were not his to explain. "You will find nothing in my house," he said, which was strictly and strategically true. He told me instead what the barn says when it is dark and snow comes off the ridge in a sheet and lays down against the door. A long insistence, ere learning to be patient around wood. Vale was good. he said, which is not absolution but a description, and willing to carry. He did not say what he had carried. He said, "There were 5, and looked at my ear as if it might understand him better than my face. When men count and stop there, you must not ask them to go on. He died at home in March. The river opened. The next week, as if it had been waiting for permission." Dartmouth's polite phrase, "Return if you can, and if you cannot, restore," kept its rhythm long after no one read it. In a spring, when the hill thawed out of order and the road went bad in front of the meeting house in a way you cannot make a witty note of, a barrel hoop washed down into the ditch at the bend. A boy found it and beat it against the fence because that is what boys do, and it gave him back 2 bright taps and then learned its manners. He took it home, and his mother hung it on a peg in the kitchen and set a braided rope through it to keep her child near her when she crossed icy yards. When she pulled the rope through the iron to take her boy down the step, she did not count at all. The mouth does it without letting the mind know. They say the pulleys never made the old noises again after the cider press came in, but that is because men prefer their ghosts mechanical. The truth is duller and harder. Wood keeps a discipline when you make it learn function against its comfort. In a Sunday in January, when the stove in the meeting house was slow and the exhorter was not, the pulleys under the cupola let go 2 little sighs, and nobody heard them because the snow on the roof took all their thinking. When the thaw came and the heavy layer slid, the pulley said once more what it had to say, and then was decent. Only one man noticed. He put his hands into his pockets and felt his thumb stroke the little ungenerous notch on the coin there and taste wintergreen and old metal and the salt of something that had not been in his mouth since his father came in from the barn without speaking one summer long before. In the probate office, the clerk who had numbered Vale's trunk was found, years later, with a bad taste in his mouth in a February with a draft. He told me, as if to show me he had learned to make his tidy mind accept smelly data, that when you put 2 ledgers together in a drawer, their smells learn each other like neighbors until you cannot tell one anxiety from another. "This one," he said of Vale's, "has wintergreen all through," and he made a face he meant as scholarly and that any person who has held a child would recognize as something else. He kept a piece of sealing wax in that drawer in case he needed to close a thing men had reopened, and the wax took on the barn's scent, and when he used it on real estate papers, you could smell, very slightly, the decency of a man arguing with himself. A map of the town hung in the school for a time. The teacher traced the road with a finger while boys nostriled the chalk dust and counted houses. She did not mean any mischief, but when her finger passed the line of the poor ground, one boy put his tongue to his lip and found it tasting of lye and old soap, and he could not prevent the small motion of counting live into his throat, like laughter he could not own. 2, then the merciful space he did not understand, then 1. He grew up and swore off church and met his wife in a different kind of room and went years without a barn. Yet when his daughter was sick and Not Vale cut the boil under her arm in the kitchen and the pan smelled like iron and the lamp like manners, he had to sit down on the step outside and count before he trusted his breath to go back into his chest. Went back to the barn because there are rooms that attach a weight to your soul, that your soul is too polite to mention until you are too far away for a return to be elegant. I did not touch the trap because age had made me cautious, and because some education ought to leave your hands alone. The corner where the stones lay held the same cool as a cellar built into a sentence, and the cider press leaned its righteous weight over work that had nothing to do with doctors. In a draft at the far end, a strip of paper lifted its edge where it had been pasted onto a beam and left, and under it was the friendly rectangle of a label. "Wintergreen," it said, in a hand fastidiously tidy enough to belong to a boy, and under that, "For gloves and teeth." You tell yourself certain. Words belong to medicine, so they will not govern your sleep. They govern anyway. In the great melt, when snow sets its mind to becoming useful, the beam under the ridge sent down a patient drip that learned the old cadence and then tired of being a parody. It went back to being a line of water and ran off, the edge of the board and into the crack that had held the grease of Dua's dozens of small histories. It is a vulgar habit of our kind to turn all sequences into lesson and all lessons into forgiveness. The barn resists you because wood does not care what you will write. It will keep wintergreen the way a pocket keeps crumbs. It will hold a shoe until the leather strings itself into the angle your mind takes when it tries to think of a child without a name and cannot. On my last day, I put the ledger open on the cider press table and looked once more at the blank under. Returned, where one juvenile had pulled up a chair. The blot, much later in the column, belonged to a spring when the river ran brown and men thought that brigandage had become outlawed by good paper. Vale's hand, in a lighter ink, had written, not under the juvenile line, but in the margin where his eye would trip as he turned the page. "I will lay the stones." He laid them. Every corner of that loft knows it. The stones keep there, cold at throat height on a man standing, and at the height of a child's head on a person kneeling. There is no poetry in that. There is only the vulgar physics of labor done after a kind of labor people respect, and how a barn learns to hold, both without making you choose. When I shut the ledger, the paper gave out the dry breath it learned in a house where wintergreen lived in a drawer. I slid the ledger into the trunk because an office wants its numbers. The barn took back its smell and its quiet. The cupola breathed because it always had. I put my hand on the doorpost out of nothing more than the decency people keep for wood when they are leaving a thing that knows too much about them. The cold climbed my wrist to where my tongue could learn it if my tongue wanted to. And it did, because habit is a worship when you are tired. The pulley under the ridge moved twice, soft to announce itself without demanding to be reckoned with. And then, after the space, a man needs to decide whether he has finished with his confession. Once. On the road, the thaw had made a hymn of mud, as always. By the meeting house, the poor ground lay plain and concealed at once, as always. I carried wintergreen on my sleeve like a sacrament no church will acknowledge. In my mouth, the iron lived politely, not as punishment, but as a measure of what I had let myself touch. All of it. Every rope and ring and stone and ledger and shoe stayed in the place where barns keep their teaching. The rest traveled with me whether I approved or not. I have never counted farther than 2 on any subject, since without waiting for the space in between to make up my mind for me, and when I arrive at 1, the barn has my breath and does what it will with it. Years have a way of returning to a room even when the furniture has changed. In a winter past the war, when the men who had learned to cut in tents came home with their hands taught by fields far worse than barns, the cider press was still in place and the loft still breathed. I knew this, not because I had gone back, but because a packet came to my door with a smell that made the hallway dilate. Not wintergreen this time, or not only. A sharper acid had moved in, the hospital tang of carbolic that men wore like an apology after Lister taught them to. Inside the packet lay a letter and a folded scrap of canvas, the corner of a field dressing spotted brown where rain had lifted blood into a halo. The letter was from a man who signed himself I. P. Not Isaac, not the boy whose hand had loved his mother, but his son, I guessed, because the hand had the same care and the same failure to hide what it was trying to keep private. "Sir," it began in the stiff generosity of a person practicing respect, "my father kept a drawing with your name in the margin and taught me to wash my hands even when the men around me laughed. I have learned now that wintergreen belongs to 2 rooms, and that a barn can teach a man what a hospital must. I enclose what I do not wish to keep. I do not wish to keep it because the smell, though clean, makes my mouth remember things our town will never be obliged to say aloud." The canvas, a thumbprint, had fixed itself in the varnish of dried carbolic mixed with fat. The whirl fit a man's pad. The scale made it an index, not a child's. I kept the canvas for a day and then put it in a drawer where stale sweet already lived. The two smells argued until I made the only fair peace there is and carried the packet to the barn. Between the war and that winter, the cider press had polished the plank where Vale kept his board. The Polish covered and did not. In a corner where a mouse had run its highways 100 nights safe because cats had more interesting business under other roofs, a scrap of label showed, the twin of the wintergreen note I had found before. This one had a later hand. Carbolic, written in a pride that had not yet learned modesty, and under it, in a boy's ink, for gloves. Gloves are new. Barns do not ask for gloves. The handwriting could have been Isaac's child's if a mother had sent him to school with apples and a careful admonition to copy what his teacher wrote, even when the mind insisted on wandering. On that visit, the poor ground was ironed flat by a crust that could carry a person if he kept his breath careful. Stones set down when Vale wrote his number kept out of sight, but put cold into the soles of your boots when you crossed them. The same way a lie remembered at a dinner table will climb from your gut to your mouth and change what you intended to say into what you cannot help saying. Near the hemlocks, the rectangle the woman had made by gate and rail still refused to grow anything but thin grass. Under the grass, the frost heaved itself in a rhythm that felt like breath if you stood, still enough to let your bones forget how to hold. A crow in the tree above scolded because that is his right and his habit. The sound broke twice, and then again once, because the world bends to certain patterns even when it has not learned their grammar. In the meeting house, there was a new stove that pulled a clean, city kind of draft, and the lay reader had translated Vale's sentence into a lesson for boys. Return if you can. If you cannot, restore. If you cannot restore, remember. Remember is a mercy people give themselves when they have run out of stones and time, but it can be a punishment too if you give it to someone else without asking his leave. The boys recited it after a passage of the Constitution, and when the word restore came, the room blinked because a cloud went across the sun and the glass in the window flexed and the whole place breathed the way a barn does when snow slides. Two girls in the front row who had not seen the inside of this barn or any like it looked at each other and put their hands under their benches and came away with dust that smelled faintly of wintergreen. They were both 14 and had no time yet for any of this. Paper in the town took on the habit of the barn the way linen does when a drawer has been devoted too long to one use. The probate clerk changed stations, and a young man took his desk. He kept pennies in the same drawer and could not keep the wintergreen off them. When he paid a man for a sow taken to market in December, the coin he laid in that palm tasted of hospital to the farmer, not because carbolic had been near it, but because his mouth had learned a route to follow when the air in a room dared to remember instruction. The farmer told his wife the clerk needed a new candle. His wife folded the coin into the hem of a dish towel to keep it from traveling further than their house would bear. And when she boiled the towel, the steam rose with the faint refresher. Odor ladies in other towns called a virtue. She opened the window and let the steam out. In barns and kitchens and rooms where men sign their names under other men's words, the exchange did what it does, set up a grammar that requires certain pauses. The barn had acquired a new hook. It hung on the post where a halter belongs. Iron upset from a link so old the hammer mark showed, and the man who hung it believed he had learned it at an auction. The circle was not the shape the valley's blacksmith makes. It was narrower in one place, as if a long nail had bent it, back after a use it was not made for. When a boy's jacket on its string made to pull through that circle, the ring told him what it had told a barrel hoop once. 2 bright taps, and then a sober one, polite for a room not intended for that talk. He ran to the kitchen with wide eyes, and his mother set the jacket where a chair could keep it from trying again. In the night, a mouse ran the rafters and dropped from a great distance onto the lip of an old pan. The sound it made repeated itself in the way air repeats learning. 2. Then the graceful interval. 1. The boy will not remember this. He will remember never to believe a man who speaks too quickly about mercy. On the east post in the loft, someone had glued a scrap from a book, pasted up where a hand might reach for courage. It was a sentence clipped from a Philadelphia journal. We will find, in time, a way to grow our subjects without trespass. The idea is a courtesy men give themselves in rooms where they have been asked to do unclean work and are honest, enough to admit it afterwards. The paste had left a dark square on the wood around the paper, and the paper was going at the edges where steam had persuaded, along with the sentences the barn kept, that nothing in that place would stay put long, without learning to be two things at once. Your eye rebels at it, and then does its job. I took Isaac's son's canvas out of my coat and set it on the cider press. The old varnish of carbolic moved when the warm room told it to, the spot that had been blood pulled out of itself a little as if air were a knife that could scrape. The thumbprint shone, clean, ridge over ridge. I put my thumb near and found that mine was narrower. That is how you understand the years. A man's thumbprint and a boy's, not the same as your own. I said none of this out loud because barns love quiet, and you do not tell them anything they did not hear before you were born. The press gave its patient groan because wood must exhale, and under the ridge the pulley declared itself twice and then offered the finishing courtesy this room keeps as its liturgy. 1. A year after that, the barn acquired a small population of swallows who learned the old holes under the eaves without asking who first bored them. They set up their nests in the polite geometry of birds who know each other. The cups they made pointed down to the trap in the loft floor, where the grease line had turned black under the cider press's righteousness. When the young fledged, they went to the ring under the cupola to try their wings. The iron took their weight and named them not at all. If you were in the yard at that hour, the ring declared their practice in a small, bright register, twice for everything the wing must learn, and then the single note that let them go. No one put it into a ledger. No one made a number for it. It belongs to the barn now. Vale's 5 stones have acquired moss in a way that makes them look as if they were laid a dozen generations ago, not one. Moss is good at hiding penance in beauty. That is one of the reasons men trust it without learning its nature. If you lay your hand on the moss, it gives back cool without scruple. At the poor ground, men set a bench one summer for the women who come to talk and not be seen. It sits under the hemlock where the rectangle refuses to carry anything better than grudging grass. The bench's slats have taken their stain the way slats do, from bodies and rain, but one slat at the back holds a darker line in a curve the size of a child's head, and in that curve, 2 dim arcs, side by side. No one has put them there. No living mouth fits them. You would have to sand down to see the wood clean, and then you would miss the only thing the bench has to say. On my last going, I tried to pass through without taking anything unnecessary back out into the road. People will tell you exit is manners. They are wrong. Exit is a debt like any other. The loft gave me the same cold at the wrist as if I had asked for a blessing and it had been granted, not because I deserved it, but because the grantor had years ago made a rule for himself and kept it. The cider press leaned, satisfied with being a respectable alibi. The grease line along the trap gave my bones their lesson without demanding a note. The cupola breathed. The pulley spoke its 2, then 1 in the voice of wood and iron and wintergreen that have taught each other their names too well ever to be parted. At the poor ground, I put my palm on the gatepost because there are certain things your hand must. Remember when your mouth refuses. It was cold. It went into my tongue anyway. On the meeting house step, a child licked her finger and touched the iron railing because that is the kind of education no one tells children not to seek. She made a little face and then, as if told by another child and not by her own meat, stuck her finger into her own mouth, and learned what wintergreen is in a place where no bottle stood. You cannot persuade a parish out of its own grammar once you have taught it to count. On the road home, mud taken up nicely by the sun, men mending fences with phrases about politics, as if nails respected votes. The sentence Vale wrote lay down under my stride like a habit my foot had been taught, to make without my brain learning it. Return if you can. Restore if you cannot. Remember if you can do nothing else. The barn keeps 2 counts and then 1. You can hear them in the pulley, in the ring, in the small tap of a cutlery drawer closed carefully because a child sleeps. If you want more from the room than that, you will be denied, as the barn denies epiphany to men who came too late. If you want less, you will be granted that too. Forgetting is a right like any other. On a clear noon in March, I stood under the cupola and let the light empty me out. The room was quiet in the way a body gets when a fever breaks. Hollowed, not healed. The pulley offered 2 bright remarks out of mere habit, and then, because manners insist, the one that lets you go. I went. The wintergreen rode with me inside, a cuff until it learned the sleeve and would not leave. And at my table when I reached home, I put my hand down, and the wood under it smelled not of my life, but of Vale's. The paper under my hand held still. The taste of iron lived where it always does, behind words, behind food, behind a prayer, in the place the barn taught in 1819 and kept teaching after. It is not a haunting. It is a ledger written into wood and rope and men and boys who count, without meaning to, and it will outlast the kind of absolutions towns commission for themselves. 2. To teach you the space in which you do not speak. 1. Which is everything you are permitted to say when the door is closing behind you on a room that kept more of your breath than you thought you had to give.